In this video, we're going to set up role-based access control, Spring Boot, to secure our API endpoints. I'm going to start this video by giving a demonstration. So firstly, we're going to try and access the endpoint getPost, and we'll see that we get an unauthorized message back, and that's because we're not allowed to get that API call without being authenticated. So what we can do is we'll set this up to set up a sign up method. So I'm going to create a new account for the email john@p.com, password with the first name, last name. I'm going to send that. And then I'm going to sign in with that because we're not currently signed in. So if I just change the email to john@p.com and I sign, notice that we get the session ID here and we're logged in as a user. So if I go to Postman to get the post and I change the session ID with that, I can go ahead and attach that to the cookie and we are now able to get that post. And notice that this is role-based access control. So I'm currently signed as a user. Note this text here, it starts with "this is the second post." I've got this helper method here which just makes the current user an admin user, and if I do that I'll get a no content back. However, if I make the request again, we'll see that we got this extra admin part of the string here. This will be something more sophisticated, like another field or something like that. However, it does demonstrate how we can use roles and give different data depending on the role. And of course we can sign out, and if I click that, it's successfully signed out message. So if I try to get the post, we get an unauthorized. So let's dive into Visual Studio Code to see how we can set this up. And firstly, I want to mention that you can get the dependency that we'll need through the Spring IO. So I've selected this Spring security dependency, and you can explore this and you can just go ahead and you can copy and paste the dependency it gives you there. So let's add that dependency to our pom.xml file. And with this starter security library, one thing it does by default is it actually secures all our APIs. All our APIs will, if we try to call them, we'll get an unauthorized. So we set up this security config file, and we're going to allow all of the API endpoints to be accessed, and we're going to actually set up the a more custom version of authentication and authorization, just because it allows you to do more things. So just to explain, firstly, in this file, we'll just get our input in here. You need to annotate the file as a configuration file. So all the files will get scanned, and then it will go to run this configuration stuff before. And then we have this other annotation called enable web security here. So we can create this security filter chain method, which is we annotate with a bean. And the first thing we want to do is we want to, based on the web HTTP security that we're getting from our security libraries, there's a method for CSRF, which is cross-site resource forgery. And what that means is you're only allowed to serve requests to the same endpoint that is requesting it, sort of thing. Since we're developing locally, we're going to, just run it through local hosts, so we don't need that extra level of security. But if you're running your server through a particular website, let's say, you would want to make sure that site matches where your API is coming from, provided it's on the same server. So we just go ahead and disable that for development purposes. what we do is we just add authorize HTTP requests, and that will just allow us to use all of our HTTP requests as we did in the previous video, because we're permitting all. And we're going to do and then we return the HTTP build. Now I just want to contrast this to what you see in the documentation here. So another approach you could use in this configuration file is you can actually match the API endpoint and you can add authorization to that, and then you can actually get the role for that. And if you're interested in doing it like that, you can do it like that. Certainly, you can just go to the Spring Security section on the documentation. However, I find that if you're building a large API, you're going to have many different endpoints, and you might want to have custom behavior for each of them. So if for example, throwing some errors and handling the payloads and the responses in certain ways, and to be able to customize it and minimize the amount of code, because you can imagine this would be one place where all the code builds up for every endpoint or groups of points, it becomes quite large and unmanageable. So of course, there's coding techniques to avoid that. However, I personally find that having the ability to have it on each API endpoint makes it more clear as you're looking at each API endpoint when you're building it. So you can actually customize that logic as well, in addition to having everything organized where it should be, rather than it split across two files. But that's just a personal preference. So with that in mind, we're going to build out our role-based authentication. So we need to have role specified. So in the security folder, I've created this role enum here, and I've just got 3 values here. So one's going to be an admin user, 2 is just a regular signed in user, and 3 is signed out. So here, one thing to mention about this is typically you might not have a signed out user, for example. You might have like a signed in user and a premium user, for example. But we're going to manage our our authorization through a session, through a cookie. So we're going to have that set in the database, and we're going to have a corresponding value in the database, a column relating to their signed in status or not. And since we're managing it that way, I'm choosing to change that field, although you could keep that field constant if you wish, and it might make more sense to do that. You would need some field that you change in the database. So we'll see that in just a moment. But here I've just added the role ID, corresponds to the number in the parentheses. And then we have a constructor. So you can create a role num based on role if you wish to do so. And we're going to have a getter to get role ID and to set role, role ID and to get the role name. So we also have this method here. It's called from role ID, because we're going to have cases where we have the role ID and we want to actually get the value that it corresponds to. So this for just simply, it loops through these options here, and you can do that by accessing the name of the class itself or the enum itself, cycling through the values, and if the role ID matches the one that you pass, you just return the role, so you get the role num object back. If it doesn't match, just throw an error there. So now we just create our user entity. So we just get our imports in here, we annotate it, and we fill the table users. Then we create a ID. We're using long to anticipate many users joining up our application. We also have a column, an allable column, a non-nullable column for the email. That's a mandatory field and it needs to be unique. And we have a first name and last name, which also cannot be nullable because we're going to need those to sign up with. And I should mention, you can also put in the parentheses, for example, there's an email annotation and, you know, a min and a max for the numbers of the string. So you can also, you know, have that sort of error handling or validation like that as well, or you could have your own custom validation. So here I have the encoded password because we don't actually want to store the password in the database in case our data gets breached. So we would have an encoded password which adds a layer of security in that event. And notice annotation, and we say that this is a write-only field. So basically we're going to use an algorithm in the security library that we got. So transform our raw password into an encoded password, saves that, and then it'll match future logins with the encoded password to tell if it's logged in or not. So we also have a role ID, and we're going to have a session ID. That's how sessions work. You have some persistent data. It's better to have it in the database rather than in memory, so you can have control over it. And then of course we will have, well, we have a role name which corresponds to the role ID. Now I've annotated this as a transient property just because it's useful to get the name of the role, for example admin. However, we don't need to save information in the database. We could create another one with just the role ID and the role name. I think that's overkill. I'm going to derive it based on the role ID via the role email class that we just created. And then of course we just have all our getters and setters, so you can just add all those in. Then we're going to create a DTO folder. So DTO is the data transfer object, and this differs to the actual database columns. It would usually be a subset, and this is just the object that we're going to pass. So you can see in the Postman, for example, if we go to the sign up method, we can see that we got this JSON load here. So we just replicate that, add the email, password, name and last name, and then add all the getters and setters for that. Then we go to do the same thing for signing DTO. When we sign in, we only need the email and a password. So let's go ahead and we get the email and get the password, setters and getters for those two fields. Of course, we'll need to create a repository. So once again, we just extend the JPA repository with the user entity that we just created. And we're going to add two additional methods in addition to the JPA repository method. So we have a session ID and an email field that we want to look things up with. So let's add those in. And most of the work that we do is going to be in this auth service. So let's go into detail about the auth service works. So this is all of our imports to start off with. Then annotate the auth service with the service annotation. We're going to auto wire our user repository, and then we have a couple of variables here. So we have a cookie name. So just to show you in Postman, when we made the GET request, so we did this route, it requires a header, and we can attach a cookie in the header, which will generate shortly. And we have a value here. So we just call this session ID, for example, and you're going to have potentially other cookies in your, in your browser, which stores various bits of information related to the website. And this is the cookie number that we're going to generate. So we generate that and we save it into the database, which is different to the approach with a JSON web token, for example, where a JWT, well, you can save it in the web database, but typically it would just be like an in-memory thing. Then that gets attached to the request, opposed to the cookie. The cookie is a little bit more secure though. And the other benefit of a cookie is that, like, having this persistent storage in the database is, let's say you have a website, but you also have a mobile application and you need to access the same login details, you can do that with the persistent storage. Okay, so we just have, you know, that key name there for the cookie. I've called it cookie name, but it's really a cookie key name. And then we have this password encode. So this is something we get from a library, and this is going to allow us to actually encode our password. So we can go ahead and we can create this up method here. So we use the DTO that we just defined before, which is the object with email, password, and so on. And then we just go ahead and we just set those properties. So one thing to note is we're setting the encode password. So we take the raw password that comes with the request and we use this password encoder, and now we encode it. And that essentially just uglifies our text for the before mentioned reasons. And go ahead and we just set the role ID. Now I'm setting this as signed out. So you'll notice that in the request here for the sign up, when you do a request, you have it as signed out, because initially you're logged out and you won't be logged in. So you're currently signed out, and the session ID of course will be null because you haven't logged in yet. Some applications, they get you to automatically sign in, and that will be easy enough because we're going to do the sign in functionality next, and you could simply sign in directly at the end of the sign up. However, I've separated the two to make things easier. So, but one thing to note is I'm actually changing the role name depending if they're signed in or not. So you would probably want to alter that logic in the database, but in your project, but it just makes it a little bit easier for demonstration purposes. So we got this sign in method here. It takes the, and then of course we just save it using the user repository. So in the sign in, when we sign in, what we want to do is we want to see if a user is already signed up. So when we sign up, we create a user record, the users table. So then we try and find that user, their email, based on the request email field that gets sent into this DTO. So basically, if the email does exist, well, firstly, if it does exist, we'll return null, and you'd want to return unauthorized or something like that. So if the user is found, we need to check password matches. So we get the raw password, and there's this password encoder library functionality that we got access to when we encoded the password. There's also matches method, which takes the raw password, and then it also takes the encoded password. So we get the encoded password from the database, because when we signed up, we encoded the password. So there's no reference to the raw password, just the encoded password. So we need to encode the password that they sent, and if that matches what's in the database, what we do is we create a session ID. So we use UUID to randomly generate a unique number, and we use that unique number to create a cookie, and that will be the session ID. So we can just create a cookie very easily, saying new cookie, give it the name that we gave it before, and the value, so the key and the value. And then just do a couple of things. We set HTTP only, And we also set it to secure, and we can set a path to, and we just, to the response, we just add the cookie. So that will, what that will do is if the user's on the front end, for example, and they just sign in, it will add the cookie into their browser, and then you'll be able to check that value from the front end. So we just put that in manually via Postman because we don't have a front end, but that would be the case if you had one. And then just go ahead and we set the session ID and the role. We changed the role from signed out, which was before. Now they're signed in successfully. So what we do is we sign them in, we persist that data. So that's the sign in method there. Of course, we would want a sign out method. And what we can do is we can take the cookie with the same cookie name, and then we just set it to null. So what that does is it will overwrite the session ID value, and we set the max age to 0, meaning it'll expire straight away. Set the path to slash, and that just resets the, on the browser. It'll get rid of the cookie, and if they're signed in, take to the home page. And then, of course, we just add that cookie to the response. So what we do is we're going to create a method in just a second, get the user from the session, because we need to get them from the session to be able to assist the data. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to just because what we're doing is in the GET request, we can see that we got this cookie and we got the session ID in here, but we're saving that session ID in the database. So we need to make sure we get the right user to delete that information. So we essentially just change the role and ID to the signed out, and we set the session ID to null, and then we just save that. And the way to get the user from the session is essentially a request. We're able to get the cookies. So we cycle through all the cookies, and then if the cookie equals, if the name of their cookie equals what we have created, it means it's a cookie. What we'll do is we can get the value of that, and we can just use this by session ID helper that we made before on the user repository. So that's how we get the user from the session. Now, if that's not there, we just return empty by using the optional empty syntax here. And finally, this is just a helper function. You wouldn't do this for real, but I'm just making a signed in user an admin. It would just save me a little bit of effort of rather than logging into SQL and change values there. Basically, we get the user from the session, so we utilize that method we just created. If it's not there, we throw an error, access denied exception. However, if we get the user, we can just change their role to the admin user and then save it. And then they'll give us access to the admin related functionality. So just to set it up, this is nice and easy. Most of the work's done now. What we can do is we can go to our Auth Controller, and we'll have a request mapping of auth, get the auth service, and the sign up is very simple. We just call the sign up method that we created on the auth server based on our DTO, and then we create a response entity, which will just be the user that we created. Of course, we don't get the password back on because we've got the Jackson annotation, and we give the status code 201, which is a post request or HTTP status created. Now sign in, we aren't creating a resource, so we can have a HTTP status okay, but once again, we just take the sign in DTO, pass it to the sign in. So we check if it's null. If it is null, we just say it's an invalid email or password and send an unauthorized back. So that's how you can sign in. Otherwise, of course, it would just sign in. And then we have a sign out method, which just calls sign out functionality we just created in the service. And finally, we've got this make user admin, which again just calls that. So the last thing we need to do is, now we've set up authorization based on roles, how do we actually protect the role? And once again, you could do it this way, where you've got everything in the one place and they're separated between the two files. I prefer to actually have it on the request itself. So when you go to a controller, you get a bit more fine-grained control over it if you sort of just check it when you need it, sort of thing. And of course, you could have like a base controller, for example, and you could abstract this logic out if you wish to do so. So what we do is we just, once again, use the get user from session method, a request, to see if it has a cookie with a session ID. And if it does, great. We can go ahead, we can get the all of the posts. Now I've done this here. I've said if the post is an admin, you know, do this. If it's not, it will just get back the data as all the posts without the admin dash in front of it. And if it's both those, you'll get the unauthorized. So we've seen all of those. And I think it's better to have it set up like this. It just means you have more complex logic, because you can, for like larger enterprise level code bases, just because, you know, you might have all sorts of different roles and you're giving back all sorts of complicated data, different situations, and you have different errors in different cases, and you have a greater level of control over things set up like that. But of course, you can set up however you want. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.